Equal is unfair. America's misguided fight against income inequality. I'm Judy Grill, and this is Bookmarks. Welcome to Bookmarks. I'm your host, Judy Grill. Income inequality has been a major theme of the 2016 presidential race, due in large part to the Bernie Sanders campaign. Here's a sample of the Sanders campaign speaking on the issue.
There is something profoundly wrong in this country when the top 1/10 of 1% own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. That is not what America is supposed to be about. There is something profoundly wrong when in Arizona and Vermont and all over this country, people are working 2 or 3 jobs. People are working incredible hours in order to put food on the table, and yet 58% of all new income is going to the top 1%. That's wrong.
But Don Watkins and Untitled Chapter of the Ayn Rand Institute have come out with a counterweight to this narrative in the form of a new book, Equal is Unfair, America's Misguided Fight Against Income Inequality. Mr. Watkins joins us today. He is a fellow of the Ayn Rand Institute and a co-author with Uran Brooks of the national bestseller Free Market Revolution, How Ayn Rand's Ideas Can End Big Government. He is also the author of Roosevelt Care, How Social Security is Sabotaging the Land of Self-Reliance. He is the host of the podcast on inequality and welfare state, the Debt Dialogues. And joining us to critique the book is welfare researcher Matthew Bruenig. He writes about politics, the economy, and a political theory, primarily with a focus on the set of interlocking issues that affect poor and working people. In addition to his blog, he has written for the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic, the New Republic, the American Prospect. In these times, Jacobin, Dissent, Salon, The Week, Gawker, and Demos Policy Shop. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Don Watkins, could you please give us, in a nutshell, the main thesis of your book?
Well, I mean, we've had this debate going on today. You mentioned Bernie Sanders, but a lot of people are talking about what's going wrong with the American dream. And the most outspoken answer to that is that the cause is rising inequality. And part of the focus of this account is that it's the rich who are rigging the system, and central to the solution is going to be that we need to take them down a peg, whether we need to penalize them through high taxes, we need to regulate them, we need to silence them through controls on political speech. And we take a very different view. We think if you keep in mind that the American dream is about opportunity. It's that open road to make of your life the best you can make it. And at the core of it is making the most of your life as a producer, of achieving success, which can mean starting a software company, or it can mean being a great plumber, but supporting yourself, that independent vision. And in our view, if that's what the core of the American dream is about, you can't revive it by villainizing and punishing the people who epitomize the American dream. And it's true that we have a lot of problems, but we think it's precisely we've gone too far in the direction of making America inhospitable towards producers. And so, yes, we have too much poverty. Yes, it is too hard to rise from the bottom. But the cause is not income inequality. The cause is that we have been putting barriers in the way of production. And what I think this really comes down to, and what our book really is focused on at the end of the day, is that there's really, beyond all the economic disagreements, beyond all of the statistical disagreements, there's a philosophic disagreement. Our view is of individualism, and I think the inequality opponents are really motivated by collectivism. Collectivism is the idea the group comes first, it is what creates wealth, and it should divvy it out according to the common good. Individualism is the view your life belongs to you and you have the right to live it, and society means we interact, we gain benefits from each other, but we do so voluntarily, not by force. And collectivism says somebody gets to dictate how you live and what happens to your wealth.
Interesting. Thank you. And Matthew Bruenig, what is your critique of the book?
So I think Ms. Watkins is right. The main issue here is a philosophical disagreement. The statistical stuff that relates to the American dream is a little bit fuzzy, and so it's somewhat difficult to argue over that. But I would disagree with his characterization of the philosophical disagreement here. He says that the disagreement is about individualism over collectivism, that on the Randian side, that they favor voluntary transactions and support for producers, and on the more egalitarian side, there's a support of collectivism. But if you actually read the book, and in fact read much of the Randian literature, what you find is Mr. Watkins is proposing an authoritarian system of government-imposed inequality. In particular, he argues that the government should violently impose a regime of private property, which he himself describes as a form of protectionism for producers. The problem with this proposal is that when government constructs and enforces institutions of property, they create inequality. It is through statist property laws that the government decides that X belongs to him and that Y belongs to her, and that X and Y are off limits to everyone else. Then it is the government that forces you to obey its decisions about what belongs to who. Anyone who ignores the property laws and acts upon the material world as they see fit is quickly scooped up and stuffed into prison. So property laws is really the core of the most tyrannical and liberty-destroying institution in the history of the world. Is because of property law that I'm forbidden from walking and roaming where I please. Is because of property law that I cannot make use of the things around me. And most importantly for our purposes here, it is property law and only property law that makes people materially unequal. Anyone who truly believes that the government should not create restrictive laws and regulations that favor some groups over others and drive up inequality by doing so must be against government institutions of property. That Watkins and his co-authors spend so much time arguing for statist property laws is very telling about where he's coming from here, which is not from a place that advocates liberty and political equality, but instead from a place that advocates violent legal protectionism of a discrete class in society, which he calls producers. He thinks the government should be organized around giving the producer class exclusive enjoyment of the material resources of the world and to deny similar enjoyment to everyone outside of this class. Thus, this book is ultimately one that advocates for a type of cronyism, whereby the government actively imposes inequality upon society by favoring some groups over others. Right-thinking people should find Mr. Watkins' brand of cronyist favoritism rather abhorrent and ask instead that the government get out of the economy altogether, meaning most importantly that it should repeal all the property laws and allow people to navigate the material world in total freedom.
Mr. Watkins, would you like to comment on that?
Well, it's certainly one theory. It's not like we invented the idea of property out of whole cloth. This was certainly the Lockean view and the founders' view, is that property is something that an individual creates. When you take an island, right? It's just land. It's just raw materials, just resources. Well, if you take a stick, you break it off of a tree, you've created a spear, now you go get a fish. That is yours. You created the material values that your life requires. And if you want to actually protect people's ability to live, and we require material values in order to live, you have to protect that process of rearranging nature in order to actually achieve human needs. And that's what the right of property protects. That's what James Madison was talking about when he talked about property. That is the real core. It's a central right. You cannot have any other freedom without property rights. Take just the right to freedom of speech. If the government controls the printing press, it sets the terms under which I can write something down and distribute it. property is the implementation of every other right. And so you cannot live if you're not free to keep and earn property. This isn't a class thing. It's not as if there's some people who are magically producers and some people aren't. Anybody is capable of being a producer. There, of course, we're talking here about adults, but it is inherent in our in the fact that we are human beings with minds, that we can create resources, and that's precisely what we need to do in order to live. And so, you know, I think it gets back to this fundamental disagreement. If you value individual life and happiness, which is individualism, then you were going to protect all human rights, including property rights. If you oppose them, you're going to look for some way to get rid of property rights so that you can take other people's stuff and give it to the people who you think are more important.
Thank you. Matt, do you take umbrage with any of this?
Yeah, I really do. So let's suppose that you believe, like Mr. Watkins does, that the state should create and impose institutions that distribute resources in our society, whether that's through property law, whether that's through tax institutions, transfer institutions, whatever. Let's suppose that was a view that you endorse. Watkins' particular brand of statist distributive institutions, which I'm just going to call producerism here because it's easier, is loaded down with problems, right? So at one point, Watkins writes, what does it mean to say that someone has earned income? In short, that he produced it. And that's essentially the argument that he's advancing here. But if you really take this to its logical end, there are a few problems. First, it says that anyone who doesn't produce things is not owed anything, right? So this includes children who obviously don't produce anything. This includes elderly people, many of whom are retired and don't work. This includes disabled people, many of whom can't work. This includes students who are in school and not yet in their productive years. This includes caretakers who are not involved in market labor but taking care of children, elderly, disabled. And this non-productive class of people is half of society. So under this sort of producerist view, literally half of society has no political entitlement to anything.
Are you saying 50%?
50%.
50%.
Children, elderly, disabled, students, caretakers, or the unemployed, people who have lost a job. That's half of society that he says has no entitlement to resources.
Let's start with a simple fact. It's not some thing that I'm imposing on anybody that you need to produce in order to have wealth. That's a fact of nature. Don't produce, there's no wealth. And so the question of justice is, who has a moral right to wealth? And I say it's the producer. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have obligations to other people. I'm a parent. I have certain legal obligations to take care of my kid. Now, thankfully, I chose to have my kids and I love them, and so it's certainly, no skin off my back. But even if I didn't, that's my legal obligation. If you're elderly, well, you have a whole lifetime to prepare to be elderly, and that's one of the reasons that we should work and try to earn a lot of money. And if the government wasn't taking so much, we could actually save and provide for our own retirements a lot better, and the vast majority of people do. So there are a small minority who simply cannot produce, and they, by necessity, however, whether it's the government or whether it's other people, they depend on those who can produce. And so the question is, imagine that you're in need. And we're always taught to imagine that you're the one giving. Imagine you're in need. Do you march up to people and demand that they give over their money to you? In a civilized society, and I think civilized people don't expect that. They don't feel entitled to other people's support. They ask and expect for voluntary benevolence. And if they don't, they understand and they go to the next door. But to demand it as a right, I think that is very ugly. I think what it does when you implement that in politics is it divides people into burdens and resources. You're a burden when you're in need. You're a resource to be exploited by society when you've achieved something. I think that is a very ugly way to treat people. I think you treat them with the dignity that comes from recognizing their rights, their freedom, including their property rights.
So a few things. First off, I think a lot of people would find it a little bit distasteful to say that, again, half of society should essentially ask for the other half of society to benevolently bestow things upon them, right? I mean, what he's essentially advocating is a kind of tyranny of working-aged, able-bodied, adult employed people, which is half of society. So old people need to go, I guess, to their kids if they have kids, or if not, just other people who happen to be working age and say, please give me money, if in fact Let's say that their retirement savings didn't materialize. Disabled people have to go around and beg. Children, I guess, could be starved to death under this view because they don't produce anything, and if they're unable to get someone to give them something, then they should die. But secondly, and I think this is perhaps the most important point, even though I've kind of buried it, is he says that under his sort of preferred laissez-faire capitalism, that you secure that producers receive that which they produce. But sort of the chief problem with capitalist economies is that's not strictly true, right? So nobody produces land or raw materials. And this has been a problem for this whole view forever. In 1840, P.J. Proudhon, French philosopher, said, "Who is entitled to the rent of the land? The producer of the land, without doubt," something he would endorse. "Who made the land? God. Then proprietor retire. And if you're not religious, then you can replace God with nobody. Nobody made the land. Nobody made any of the material resources that compose every single physical product that we consume. All of the material resources, the raw materials, just exist. Secondly, even if you get around the fact that you have issues with land and raw materials, capitalists do not produce capital income. So this income, which is about 30% of the national income that's distributed out each year, is actually called unearned or passive income. A capitalist doesn't produce interest, they don't produce rents, they don't produce dividends, they don't produce capital gains. They don't produce any of this income. At best, you can say that the underlying capital goods, the things that they own, machines, are productive. But you are not your capital. Capital income is income from owning, not income from producing. And as we discussed before, ownership is a function of the very government-imposed economic institutions that we're debating about.
I don't
so a
think
proper,
you,
excuse me.
Well, you've gone on for quite a bit. Let me address just those points, because you raised a bunch of stuff. The first stuff was just misrepresenting. I said what our obligations to other people are, and the fact that the elderly have a whole lifetime to produce. So that's just ridiculous. But I don't think you know what production is. Production is using your mind to transform the raw materials of nature, which have no value apart from us figuring out their potentials and taking effort to transform them for the betterment of human life. Land is useless to human beings until we figure out ways to make it useful and then act to make it useful. And it is by that process that we actually raise our standard of living. That is how something becomes property. As for capitalists not being productive, they're some of the most productive people in society. Why? Because they have to use their mind to match money with talent, to match the actual tools of production and the fuel of production with talent. And if they don't do it, well, we go through a thought experiment in the book where we say, imagine you eliminated finance, you eliminated investment, you eliminated capital. We would have nothing. We would have nothing. We'd have zero standard of living, because every productive act that takes place over time requires resources, and somebody has to figure out where they go. And guess what? It ain't easy. If it were easy, then you wouldn't have so many people going broke trying to be investors.
He has made a really fundamental error here. He has mistaken capitalists with entrepreneurs. It is entrepreneurs who are in fact working that connect capital to talent or labor or production. Capitalists, people who merely own the stuff, are not necessarily involved in that. I'll give you a good example. I have a 401k. I have money in the 401k. It's invested, I believe, at this point in S&P 500. I don't do anything. It just sits there. Last quarter, I checked it before I came here. I got $200 of gain from that. What did I produce? I produced nothing.
You produced an income that got invested that you didn't consume. So that wealth that you created that wasn't consumed is now being put to productive uses. But you're talking about an index fund. Does Warren Buffett produce nothing?
Well, Warren Buffett is involved in some entrepreneurial activities, but let's again be clear.
How would entrepreneurs work if nobody figured out to give them money? Steve Jobs, it was a capitalist who judged he was worth a risk and put money in his hands, and if he hadn't, we wouldn't have Apple.
You're referring to, again, people who actually manage money. I don't manage my 401k. It just sits there. I didn't even know what was going on. I checked it at the end of the quarter at $200 extra. What was that? And let's be clear, you have now shifted the argument. You said capitalists are involved in essentially the coordination of resources, which is actually what entrepreneurs did. And then you subtly shifted and you said, well, actually, you're owed your capital income because you abstained from consuming your wealth. That is the whole, what they call wages of abstinence argument for capital income, which is different from the argument that I actually worked and made sure my stuff was being productive. I didn't do that. It just sat.
No, there's two things that happen. See, it's very simple. People work, they create wealth, and sometimes they just consume it right away. Like, right, I consume most of my wealth, mostly on my kids. But sometimes you save it. You set it aside. You don't consume it. And then it gets invested. Now there's people who are making the active decisions about where to invest money. That is a productive act. But you're also setting aside your consumption. And that, by the time value of money, is what gives rise to the phenomenon of interest.
How does
this is basic economics. It shouldn't be too hard to see that there should be an incentive, because guess what? If you didn't get interest on that money, why set it aside?
All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. We have Lucille Pope. And she asks, at what point does income inequality become so bad that it threatens social stability? And go ahead with that, Don.
Well, I think that's the wrong perspective. I don't think economic inequality per se ever leads to social instability. I think people's view of the justice of how much of what wealth people have is what leads to instability. So if you have a corrupt regime where everybody's dirt poor, say like Cuba or someplace like that, because they're being exploited by a bunch of rich guys who coerce to keep them down and take a bunch of their money, then yeah, that creates a really unstable situation. But you don't see rich, prosperous, generally semi-capitalist countries becoming unstable just because some people succeed a lot and the vast majority of us are just pretty rich by world and historic standards. So it's not an issue of the gap. Remember, inequality does not refer to poverty per se. It just refers to the gap. And if you have a gap that fundamentally reflects that people are free and create different amounts of wealth and save different amounts of wealth and so on, there's nothing to fear from that, and there's no reason to expect it to lead to instability.
If you can sort of judge from what happened in the past and say, well, we're kind of moving in that direction now, then maybe that same instability that led to those movements will lead to more movements here. I don't know that, hopefully in a democratic society, that doesn't lead to breakdown. You just get new politicians in who are more interested in changing taxes and benefits and that kind of thing.
Okay, let me ask the next question, okay? This one is from Kirk Patton. He asks, given rising standards of living, does the definition of poverty in the United States need to be updated? Go ahead, Don.
I mean, this is actually probably a question where I would defer to Matt. I know a little bit about how we define poverty rates. I mean, from my perspective, so I'd like to hear what he has to say about how we measure it and how we define it. But from my perspective, I want to take a bigger picture look at this. I don't think the starting point of any inquiry in terms of our economic well-being should be, what do we do about poverty and what's going on with poverty? The real first question in any discussion has to be, how in the world did we get to a point where most Americans are, by world and historic standards, so rich? Because poverty is the given. That's what we're born into. We're born into the world without wealth. Human beings, aren't born in the Garden of Eden. And so the real question is, where did all this prosperity come from? And that's really what our book is about, is what is the source of prosperity and how do we encourage that? And that's how you defeat poverty over time. And that's why I think the greatest success story of the last 30 years is the fact that global poverty, and this is defining in absolute terms, I believe $1 a day, or they might have adjusted it to $1.20, $1.25, something like that, has declined from 40% to 14%. That's an amazing achievement. And the number one explanation for how that's happened is that countries like India and China have taken steps towards liberating their economy to look more like freer economies. That's something we need to celebrate and investigate. And I've heard a real deafening silence on the part of inequality critics about that, because it doesn't fit with their narrative. And the narrative is that the more power the government has over the economy, the better off we're all going to be. The more it cracks down on producers, the better off we're going to be. I think a fair, just society, and one that truly fights poverty, is one that liberates producers.
Thank you. And go ahead, Matt.
So the way that we, the official poverty metric that we use right now was created in the 1960s by a person named I forget her name now. It was a census worker. Anyway, so they create this poverty line. It was basically triple what they thought a family would need to eat. So it was just kind of rule of thumb, and then it's just been adjusted for inflation ever since. The problem that a lot of people see with this, and the problem that's mentioned in this question, is that for a lot of people, poverty is a relative thing. Adam Smith, for instance, defined poverty in relative terms. How poor someone feels depends on who they're around, what kind of societies they're in, and how rich the people around them are. And so in Europe, they have this notion of poverty as social exclusion. And you can become socially excluded if your standard of living really starts to trail the standard of living of everyone else, because you're really living a much different life than the people around you. And
You
so
mean up or down?
Up or down, right?
Yeah, okay.
They focus on the bottom. They don't. But that's a good point. Actually, you could talk about social exclusion at the top as well. But that's what they worry about. So the way that they often define poverty, and I actually think is a better way to do it, is you find the median income in the country, right? That's where half the people make more and half the people make less. You take that number and you divide it by half, and that becomes the poverty line. And so as median incomes go up, then the poverty line goes up. Or if median incomes go down, then the poverty line goes down. And that gives you a good sense of how many people are really very distant from the way most people live. And that kind of tracks probably that questioner's notion of poverty, which is being really socially excluded from normal society.
Okay, that's all we have time for. And again, the book is Equal is Unfair, America's Misguided Fight Against Income Inequality by Don Watkins and Ayn Brooke of the Ayn Rand Institute. And thank you, Mr. Watkins, for joining us to discuss the book, and to welfare researcher Matthew Bruenig for his critique. And thank you all for watching Bookmarks. I'm Judy Grill, and we'll see you next time.